Hey, Strong Girls. I'm Molly Herford, sports journalist, ultra runner, cyclist, and author, and founder of Strong Girl Publishing.
And I'm Dr. Sasha Golish, Executive Director of Yellow Running Shoes, a researcher, engineer, elite runner, and your BFF who's breaking down the science of smashing barriers in women's sports.
Think of us as the intersection of science and culture for women and girls in sport. Each week, we'll dissect the latest headlines and cutting-edge research on female athletes.
Debunk myths about girls in sport. Talk about how hormones affect performance at every age, to the latest research in sports science around mental performance, nutrition, equipment, and so much more.
And we'll spotlight badass girls and women who are rewriting the rules of the game, sometimes literally.
Expect it to be nerdy.
And occasionally TMI.
But it will always be honest.
Whether you're a strong girl yourself or you're raising one, this show is for you. Welcome to Strong Girl Talk,
where sports science meets sisterhood.
All right. Hello, Strong Girls. Welcome back to another episode of Strong Girl Talk. This is our first emergency episode, which, might feel like a lot, but we really felt like the topic warranted having an emergency episode, not just kind of fitting it into our normal schedule. World Athletics introduced sex testing. What does this mean? What does this mean for you as an athlete? What does this mean for you as a parent, as a coach, as a fan of women's sport? This is something that, you might have seen a headline, probably not, because this was frankly very subtly introduced. And that's kind of why we wanted to have this emergency episode. But it's something that I think bears digging into. We think bears digging into because it's something that at first glance, you might not think much of it. But it is, as many things are in sport, very nuanced. There's a lot of history here. So we're going to, dig into this. Before we get going, let's just mention, we are smart women. We are well-researched women. Sasha has done the deepest of dives into this. I cannot stress how long she has spent digging into all of this. I've done my homework on it. No one is the expert in this, I think is really the thing. And everyone is going to come at it from their own biases. We are trying to check ours. We are trying to be as research focused as possible. But, just putting it out there that we are not perfect. We may say something wrong, get something wrong. We're trying to be very thoughtful about this. And we are really leading with the lens of wanting girls and women to feel safe and comfortable and cared about in sport as humans, coming at it from a position of humanity, and with just the deepest compassion for every athlete. So what exactly are we talking about? Sasha, explain what happened at the press conference just last week.
So following the Indoor World Championships, there was a press conference on March 25th. And World Athletics has effectively stated to preserve the integrity of competition in the female category, that it's a fundamental principle of athletics. And they state that the majority of stakeholders consulted in the last month on the proposed new eligibility conditions for the female category agreed that allowing only biological female athletes to compete in the female category was essential to maintaining fairness. So transparently, I submitted as part of that consultation. I actually submitted twice. I submitted on my own behalf, and I submitted as part of a group that was responding on a specific subset of athletes. And I'd love to actually see that data. I'm not disagreeing with it. I just would, evidence-based research. I just love to see the data. But also coming out of that is they said that over the next few weeks, the new regulations will be drafted and the pre-clearance SRY. So SRY is a way of testing for the Y chromosome. So a SRY test provider process and timeline will be agreed upon. And so I watched the press conference, and what it seems like is they're going to implement this for the World Championships that will take place in Tokyo in September 2025. Again, that's just based on the information that I've heard. I'm going to pause there. Any questions?
Well, I think we're probably all just a little confused what even pre-clearance of SRY even means, right? Talk to me about, let's maybe give the brief backup bird's eye view. What are we talking about in terms of this sex testing, and why does it matter? Who are the women who could be left out of this or, hurt by this or, you know, I hate to say pass fail, but like fail this.
You're not wrong though, right? It is a little bit of a pass fail. And so, you know, we'll dive into this in the episode, but one of the ways that males and females are categorized is based on chromosomes, right? There's also hormones, endocrinology. Apparently that's a tough word for me to say out loud. It's okay in my head. Um, your internal genitalia, your external genitalia. So again, they're looking for chromosomes. And so they're suggesting that in the testing that they are going to divide. And actually, let's go back here and say, like, historically, sport was divided by sex, right? Sport was in its inception really designed for males. There's some emerging research actually coming out of the Middle East that there was sport for females. I'm really curious to see as that comes out in Cambridge. But historically, we know sport was created for males, and then we created the female category. But sport was divided by sex because, again, generally speaking, not in the nuance, the world sort of divides neatly, and I've got some data on this, into male and female. And so, you know, if you think of it like a wireframe, diagram of like, well, what's an easy way to test something for a yes, no, right? A pass fail, as you just say, is, if XY is male and XX is female, generally speaking, as chromosomes make up part of our genetic makeup, then what we can do is, you know, cheek swab you. So take some of your saliva and test for the presence of this Y chromosome. And if it exists, then the effect, as you've said, unfortunately, you fail. And there's these like other things that get investigated. And that's also the history behind it as well.
Right, right. And okay, so the swab is the likely methodology of doing this is going to be like a cheek swab and it's going to get tested. Um,
Yeah, and they're expensive, by the way. Didn't know that, but they're very expensive for what a cheek swab is. It's not a COVID test.
And to be clear, this is not just to rule transgender athletes out of the competition. I think like when people hear this, and no matter where you fall in that debate, and that's, I mean, a whole other, you know, can of worms, let's say. And I think, again, I'm always a lead with humanity, lead with inclusion kind of person. But it what they're really looking for here is the DSD athletes, I think, like transgender and DSD athletes. And I think they're really like this is where the nuance really gets tricky, scary, stressful. Um, and it's very much coming for what the concept of like what does it mean to be a woman. So DSD, maybe actually let's back up and get some like definitions going. Sasha, can you explain what DSD is?
For sure. Let me actually just go back to your point about transgender and differences of sexual development. So DSD actually originally stood for disorders of sexual development, but like just period wrong, differences of sexual development. But on February 10th, there was a consultation launched that sort of had this pre-clearance for eligibility in the female category. And it was a consultation on the eligibility in the female category and the current differences of sexual development regulations and transgender regulations. So currently in world athletics, those two things stand alone. And when we talk about the differences of sexual development, resources, they're really talking about a specific category of differences of sexual development. And they're the ones, short story, and again, not an expert, that have an XY, but have an XY and actually can use testosterone. And I'll get more into that in a bit. But with this consultation, they actually want to combine the policy into one. And what you so eloquently said there is a difference in those individuals. Transgender people do not want to be identified as intersex or differences of sexual development or people with natural variations. Likewise, these people with these natural variations also do not want to be categorized as transgender. And so we're dealing actually with the gender construct and with the sex construct, and they are very distinctly different things. And some people in both of those categories may identify as the other, but just to be like very clear that these are two different types of individuals. And that's where some of this contention has really come out. And I think that's why it's been important. So I'm going to, again, pause for questions here with you before we get into like the definitions.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the other big thing here and why you and I both are very like hyped up about this is there's also like a very real chance that someone could in fact be a DSD athlete and be completely unaware of it. Like that is the thing that I want to make extremely clear. This is not something that, you and I have talked offline about what frustrates us about all of this time, energy, money getting poured into this versus into actual anti-doping and checking people for actively cheating. Um, this is not just looking for athletes who are purposefully like breaking these rules or like pushing these boundaries, but also can very well, and I would argue will very well, really ruin some women's lives who, are not like they just don't know that they are a DSD athlete because it is very easy to have some of these DSD, these differences and never become aware of them, especially if you are an athlete, because a lot of the women's ones, part of the thing is that they wouldn't menstruate. But if you're an athlete who has gone through as like a pretty elite athlete in your teen years, in your preteen years, you very well may not have any idea that this is you. You may not have any clue. And to me, like that is just like that is where it gets so frustrating and scary and challenging. And not just at the elite level. There's all of this is, the reason we're talking about this is because, what happens at these high levels tends to then trickle down into college and then into high school and then into middle school. And we know in the US right now, there is a lot of stuff being done that is going into the elementary school level and, making sure that trans kids aren't allowed to play with the gender that they identify with, all of that kind of stuff. And you can very easily see this testing going way down into girls' sport, which I think is the scariest thing of all. Sasha, you and I talked about this last week. Let's talk about our reactions here when we were picturing, little Sasha, little Molly, 12 years old, 13 years old, looking at these tests. How would you feel?
I mean, I said this to you. I said this to my dad, and this took my dad by surprise. But I said, like if someone had asked me at 12 years old to take this test, I would have dropped out of sport. I would have been afraid that I would have been identified as a boy. And, younger than that, I actually just, was talking with someone about I wanted to be a boy, right? But it wasn't that I identified being a boy. I identified playing sports, right? Like I grew up in a time where like boys played sports and girls played with dolls. Like that, like I'm old. But I would have dropped out of sport. I would have been really afraid that, while I wanted to be a boy, someone then would have told me. And it's that idea of like being curious versus somebody telling you what to do. I mean, share with us what your reaction would have been.
I mean, as a kid who didn't play sports, let's add the caveat that like I was clearly not in sports regardless. But frankly, I had the exact same reaction. Like even now as a adult woman who has in fact menstruated in her life, I would still be terrified of that test because I would still feel like, oh my gosh, when I was younger, especially like I grew up very muscular, very naturally muscular, always feeling like a little bit like bigger, burlier than the other girls in my class. And like, the reality is I grew into a very small human, but I was grown to this size at the age of 12. So at that age, I was different. And I would have been like, I hated that I was different. This is like the age of Mary Kate and Ashley, too. So bearing in mind, like, very skinny was very in. I was not in. I did not have that kind of body. I would have been so afraid of finding out that I was more different than I already felt. So, a lot of girls gravitate towards sport because they feel different, because they feel like a little uncomfortable. And how many young girls are now finding like wrestling or soccer or some of these sports that embrace the fact that they are not maybe as traditionally feminine. And they finally have found this place where they feel like, oh, comfortable and belong and all of that. And then boom, like, no, we're going to test you to make sure that you're a girl. Like, that is messed up. Like, just period across the board. Like, I cannot stress like how dangerous that is to girls' sport. Also, like let's just add a barrier, right? Like
Yes.
even for, elite women athletes, who's covering the cost of this? Who is covering the cost of this testing? It's probably going to come back on the athletes in some way, shape, or form.
Well, it's money that doesn't go into research into, to female-bodied research. I was actually thinking about this. I've been sex tested. So we'll just talk about WADA now. So under the WADA rules, you can, if you choose as an international federation to test, I think basically the word comes down to transgenderism, which is a terrible word, but you can choose to test somebody's sex. And given how many times I was tested between 2016 and 2019, for sure, in those tests, someone tested my sex. So yes, I was actually like, no, I know I haven't failed. But I like actually was concerned. I was like, even in this day and age, right? Had I not done this before, there is still a part of me that is like, do I not do this? Because what happens if it comes back different?
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that is like, there's just no way that you and I are the only people who would feel that way, the only women who would feel that way. And again, it's just like, okay, let's just put up yet another barrier for women in sport. It's just very frustrating, especially when, it is this like protect women's sports conversation, but so little is being done elsewhere to protect women's sport. Equal pay, sexual harassment, perhaps. I think it was like over 20% of elite women athletes say that they were sexually harassed, abused, assaulted as child athletes. So this isn't even like, total in their career. This is when they were children. That's messed up. You know, bullying, rampant in sport, um, you know, all of these things. And again, coming back to intentional doping for the purpose of, yeah, Sasha has this fantastic Runners Against Doping shirt on. Um, doping for the explicit purpose of, getting ahead in competition. Like this is where money could be going. So again, you always have to follow the money trail as well, right? Like where could we be putting this money? It's not, there is at some point a limit to the amount of money being pumped into women's sport by these organizations, by WADA. And if it's going towards this, where isn't it going?
Oh, I'd love to know. So let's pause. We're gonna come back to all that. Let's get into the definitions, right? I
Love it.
think I think to have this conversation, we need to go back and do like a little bit of foundational work. So I'm using the work from a combination of various resources. So from the Trans Student Education Resource, from Joanna Harper's book, Sporting Gender, and
Fantastic read, by the way. Side
oh, you've
note,
read it?
oh, I am like halfway through. It is so good. Like it's the definitive. Like if you have any questions after this episode, I highly recommend going and reading it because it is written in layman's terms, but so well done, well researched. Fantastic.
Well, Joanna Harper's a friend of mine. That's how she talks. Like this is Joanna Harper. This is who she is. Um, and from You Can Play, which is a Canadian inclusion sports agency. And so think of a human rights meets a sports agency to develop inclusive language and resources. And I really just can't say enough about the great work that group is doing. So actually, I'll pass it to you and ask a question. Do you want me to talk about gender or sex first?
Let's maybe first like highlight the difference between the two.
Yeah. So, and here I think is where it gets tricky and where people get upset, right? Like we keep saying like sex is biology and gender is how you show up in the world. And sex isn't just biology. It's physiology, it's endocrinology, right? And maybe that all falls under the umbrella of biology, but because biology's become so weaponized, I think it's a better idea to talk about it in some broader terms. And again, back to Joanna Harper's book, she does a brilliant job of talking through this. And so sex is very much like the things that happen in our bodies, right? Like periods. Periods are about sex. They don't actually care how you want to show up in the world. If you are like a naturally menstruating human, you are going to get your period, right? It's your pituitary gland talking to the hypothalamus. That is sex. Where gender identity is like, how do you want to show up in the world? How do you want to express yourself, right? Like, what makes what makes you show up and shine out as your true self? That's gender.
Love it. Love it. And I know your biggest pet peeve is when not just people, but like government agencies, like the highest level, even actually in some of, I believe, some of like the stuff around all of what we're talking about today, they've used them just casually in lieu of each other. Um, and that is so problematic because that means they're putting stuff out and not even like fact checking because it is inherently wrong.
Yeah. So what Molly's getting to is it really, I'm gonna use bothers, frustrates, anguish, frustration, sadness. It's sadness when we confuse the word gender and sex when we say verification. There's no test in the world that tells you how someone shows up for them to be the best version of themselves. We've got some proxies of tests around sex that test for chromosomes, they test for hormones, they test your endocrinology. None of those tests alone define your sex. And none of those tests represent gender. And that for me that's been really hard. And you have been an incredible support through this. So thank you.
Ditto. Because yes, I agree with everything you said wholeheartedly. And yeah, this is so like, we always talk about like sport is sort of this like metaphor for everything else going on in the world. And I think this testing, this stuff right now is probably the most acute example of that I have ever seen in my life in terms of like what's going on with women's rights. The UN just did a report actually that said this is the first time in decades that women's rights kind of across the board are actually decreasing worldwide. And I think this is just like another, microcosm of seeing that play out. Okay, let's let's talk let's talk sex. You just mentioned, I think what was really interesting that you just mentioned is it's beyond chromosomes. It's beyond XY, XX, and that's what they're testing. Um, but there's so many, I'm especially noticing like, secondary sex characteristics, the physical characteristics, in particular, the Q angle. Dun dun dun, which for runners, cyclists, that's huge. Breasts, that's huge. Like all of that stuff. And it's not as black and white as or binary as we once, thought.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into talking about the science behind it. So I'm going to take Joanna Harper's seven biological elements, right? So you've mentioned a few of them, but I will go in her order because she did an outstanding job with this. So she talks about gonads, right? And so you're like, what? Think about it just like very simply. Do you produce, generally speaking, sperm or eggs, right? And then we have external genitalia, which is generally how sex is identified at birth, right? When you see that piece of paper that says sex, really what they should be saying is, what was your sex identified at birth, right? And that's generally where a doctor looks at a baby, looks at, does it have a penis or does it have a vagina? Then we have our internal genitalia, which are our testes and our ovaries. My ovaries during perimenopause, I wanted to kill because they hurt so bad. But that, side note. Chromosomes, we just talked about, generally speaking, show up as XX and XY, XX for female, XY for male. Hormones, I put estrogen and testosterone in brackets, but I want to expand on that a little bit. So estrogen is the main sex hormone, the main sex hormone for females, right? It's what drives us, right? It's what drives our reproductive cycle, which is our periods. It's what drives our recovery. So how we use estrogen and how males use estrogen is a little bit different. Males, their primary sex hormone is testosterone, right? What I want to say here, and I think is so important, females have testosterone and males have estrogen. And I think that nuance has been lost in the conversation. The amount that each of those, females and males have is different. And that's a little bit of what changes our biology. Okay, so back to this. So I think it's number 5, secondary sex characteristics, right? You talked about breasts. I was going to say boobs, right? I like to say the word boobs. And the Q angle. I'm totally going on a deep dive on the Q angle soon, although a few other projects. And then what I loved about Joanna Harper talking about this is your gender identity, right? She started to bring a human rights and a human aspect to the biological elements. And I think this is where it gets tricky, right? You said, like chromosomes don't make you a male or female, right? They're part of that. And yes, it's actually the easiest thing to test because you can do it with a cheek swab. Dry blood spot test, which is another one of the proposed testing methods from World Athletics, will look at your hormones. But none of these tests can tell you, one, how you want to choose to show up in the world, but two, a test isn't going to tell you everything about yourself. There's just so much nuance, right? Like we're both female bodied people, but my hormones and your hormones for sure totally different, right? There's so many things about us that are different. And then before I let you ask questions, the DSD. So when people talk about the gender spectrum and the sex spectrum, there's a very small percentage of people in the world that fall on the sex spectrum. Most famous would be Castor Semenya. Castor Semenya is not female or male. I just made that one word. She is a difference of sexual development individual or an intersex or sex variation person. She is a woman. Castor Semenya is a woman, but she falls on the sex spectrum, as do 0.02 to 0.04% of the world.
Right. And I mean, we'll get into it. Joanna Harper gets into it. Yes, I would say that percentage is represented in athletics. That sounds like a very tiny percentage, but that is a percentage that is naturally going to be very gifted athletically for the most part. So it does come up. This is not to say that this doesn't come up, but Caster Semenya, definitely a woman, like period, cut, set, print. Um,
Yeah.
the other thing I wanted to come back to that's really interesting, I love that she includes gender identity as one of the things. And, you know, we say want to show up in the world or how people want to show up in the world. And I think you and I both realize when we're saying that, we also mean how they need to show up in the world, right? This is not like someone wakes up and is just like, it would be, kicks, fun for kicks. Today is, I'm going to do this. This is it is a genuine physical thing. And I think in, coming decades, we might see that, there is difference in like whether there's like something in the brain that we haven't figured out yet. Like, I just don't think that this is a choice for people. And I think that's why it's a very important one of the biological qualities is because like there is a very good chance that there is a biological thing here that is like causing this to not be an option for some people, that people need to show up in this different way, that they do identify in this way, and it's not a choice necessarily.
Well,
Um,
and actually, to Joanna's research, yes, there are, she talks about the genomes, she talks about brain chemistry, and I can't remember if it's her research or others' research, but you're right. These people biologically, gender identity is affected biologically, how you need, want, and do show up in the world.
exactly. Yeah. Okay. Love it. Love it. I think we've here. You have a note about the gender unicorn.
Have you seen the gender unicorn?
I have not. You've mentioned it
Oh,
before. We'll include a link in the show notes.
yeah,
Um,
they are there. I don't actually know how the gender unicorn identifies, so I'm going to go with they just to be safe. Um, it's part of the U. I think it's part of the You Can Play resources. I don't. I think it was developed. I know it was developed in concert with a whole host of different researchers. But I love this. It's the internal perception of a person's gender and how they label themselves based on how much they align or don't align with what they understand their options for gender to be. So common identity labels include, and this is like a big one for me, man and woman, not male, female, right? Male, female are our sex terms. Man, woman, these are our gender terms. Gender queer and trans. And I just gender expression, right? It's how you show up in the world, right? Combination of dress, demeanor, social behavior. And we sort of make sense of these right now. And I actually am like, hey, gender unicorn people, let's go back and visit it as scales of masculinity and femininity. How do we shift that scale to say, and people that show up in a non-binary way?
Especially now, where I feel like even how we define masculinity and femininity almost doesn't exist anymore, except in ways where we're almost making fun of the constructs.
Yes. Oh, wholehearted yes.
Like, when was the last time you heard someone talk about masculinity in a way that was genuine and not making fun of it? Unless it's a guy who defines himself as an alpha male, in which case he's probably not listening to this. And you can guess how I feel about that.
I was gonna say toxic masculinity, like we talk about it and do research on it for sure. But other than that, no, I think I'd love to see those two terms start to vanish, start to
Hmm.
disappear.
Well, and I think even just the terms themselves really are kind of what's the word? They're very similar to male and female, masculine, feminine, male, female. Again, gender is not the same as male, female. So I really think we need some better adjectives going. Um,
And Yeah, and I think if we're thinking about that spectrum, right? I'd love to it, it's almost like it is like politics. Katie Barnes, their book is fantastic, right? Like how sports shapes the gender, how sports shapes the political conversation. Sorry, Katie. I apologize, Katie. Great, fair play's great. But this idea, if gender is much more of a continuum, and where I am on the continuum varies day to day, right? And it's not about being more masculine, more aggressive, more assertive, or more feminine, more passive. It's just about what I choose to wear, how I choose to do my hair that day, who I'm interacting with, right? And that, if we just think about it, it's like, yeah, you have total control over that.
100%. Yeah. Okay, so I think that really like hopefully gives everyone an idea of the definitions, or at minimum, a sense of just how nuanced this discussion is, and that when we put it into 10-second sound bites and one-page PR statements, we are just incapable of covering the entirety of it and understanding it. So do you want to get into the history a little bit here?
Yeah.
Give us how like, because this is not the first time that sex testing has been introduced. And as you say, it's I think what's frustrating is like it's not even the first time they've been doing sex testing in recent years. Like this has been part of testing. Now we're just suddenly making it where every woman needs to do this thing. Anyway, history.
Well, and I think part of that history lesson actually is talking about femininity, right? The reason that women were not allowed to play sport was because they needed to show up in a very like stereotypical classical feminine way, and sports was not seen as feminine. And so if you looked masculine, you were other. People pointed fingers, people asked questions, right? And this carries this forward. That history of pointing people out for looking a certain way is carried forward. So
And let's also point out the double standard real quick here of then when woman presents in an ultra feminine kind of way as an athlete, she is also completely torn down. The article that I have gotten the most hate mail for, the most hate mail, was an article about how to wear makeup when you're a cyclist. And it was literally interviewing professional, like Emily Batty and Tiffany Cromwell, like top cyclists. The first sentence was, "You don't need to wear makeup on the bike. No one is telling you you need to wear makeup on the bike." The amount of hate that I got, even from like some, I'm not gonna lie, some women who like I really respected at the time, and actually who have since apologized to maybe give them a little bit of credit here, that were like, "Oh, I can't believe you're wasting your time on this." Um, and the women who get absolutely just destroyed in the media for like doing a nice photo shoot where they look good, or like posting a cute picture. Like this is all just getting back to like trying to find ways so women just cannot win here. Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
totally. Oh my gosh, totally. And it's not for actually anybody to comment on, I think is like really what it comes down to. So sex testing started at the 1960 Olympics, and I'm pretty sure it was winter because they used to be winter and summer at the same time, and just winter comes before summer, just. But in 1936, before there was, a break in the Olympics due to World War II, there was a woman named Stella Walsh. Stella Walsh was actually raised in America but competed for Poland. And I'm taking this from others' work, and it's in everything that I've read, this is how Stella was referred to. But she was called Stella the Fella. And
Charming, really.
charming, unbelievable athlete. Oh my gosh. All I remember is her accolades and how well she did. And this is 1936 when Stella the Fella. In 1928, there's the famous 800-meter race where like the women cross the line and they all fall down. Having run the 800, the only way that you can do it properly is to, in fact, just make it across the finish line. But it wasn't feminine enough, and Stella wasn't feminine enough. And so in 1960, they called it the Pokin Parade, right? They say they were female doctors, but does that matter, right? Like, wholeheartedly, I'm not comfortable. I'm not a nude parade person. I'm not comfortable with nudity. I went to summer camp. I always showered with the curtain, but I would be really uncomfortable if someone said, to participate in this race this year, I need to see your bits.
Yes, and I would also like to know like how this parade situation worked. Either way, it feels beyond gross. It
Yeah.
feels extremely problematic. It feels very reminiscent of some very problematic times in history. Lots of things wrong with this. Just lots of things wrong with this.
Well, and then they got to this cheek swab, right? Where it's similar to what the proposal is now, and now is a little bit more sophisticated given where we are with technology. But it was this idea of like cheek swab, do you have this like smear, the buccal smear, which identifies whether or not you have an X or a Y? And I can't, it was if it was smeared, I think it's an X. It doesn't matter. Because in 92, the IAAF, which is now World Athletics, they abandoned it, right? They said that it was discriminatory, it was invasive. And finally, in 1996 at the Olympics, that was the last time they tested people. And so, like Molly, I remember watching the 96 Olympics, right? There was no, I think what really got my like hair on the back of my neck standing up was I didn't know about sex testing. So, like, it happens, it's the man behind the curtain, right? It happens behind closed doors. And like the things that we put the athletes through and then expect them to perform on the world stage. Like everything's got to be accountable and transparent. And I think that's what's bothering me about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more. And I mean, I think, we all know about drug testing, the peeing in a cup, all of that. And like I'm very pro drug testing. What I like about drug testing is it in very much theoretically, like let's be real here, but it theoretically applies to men and it's done with men and women in the same way. Um, it seems just so bonkers to me that we can just add this whole added layer just for women. Um, I'm like, if we're gonna do this, can we just shove something in men's mouths too? Like, just putting it out there. If we got to do
And
it.
I was going to actually be really, anyways, I'll just park that thought. I do want to say, so in 2004, the International Olympic Committee had a transgender policy. And what Joanna, again, so eloquently talks about in her book is we've had a policy that has permitted transgender participation since 2004. One of the criticisms surrounding transgender participation in particular, less so around differences of sexual development, is that there will be a flood of transgender athletes competing. It
When?
hasn't.
Where are they? They haven't been here yet. Putting it out there.
Well, and again, and Joanna so articulately tells that story through the lives of some differences of sexual development athletes and some transgender athletes. Like, it's just such an important point, which is why I couldn't not include it here.
It does seem like we've been now talking about the fact that there's going to be a storm of them coming to the Olympics for the last, I don't know, four Olympic cycles now, and I have yet to see that. Five, yeah. Five Olympic cycles has yet to be a thing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I do actually want to include in the show notes an article I did a couple years ago now with Chelsea Wolfe, who is a transgender BMX racer in the US. I did for bicycling, and honestly, it's one of my favorite pieces I've ever written. Chelsea is just, it's one of the articles I'm most proud of because I think, again, no matter what side of the argument you fall on, I think it really forced people to come to terms with the fact that when you are talking about transgender athletes, intersex, any of these athletes, you are talking about people. You are talking about actual human beings. This is not just like a stat on a page or, black and white like text on a thing. This is an actual flesh and blood human who is frankly not having a good day. Like,
Well, so I talked about things in the world that make me shut down when you demean and dehumanize people. And actually, I remember your story. I'm excited to read it again. It beautifully captured who that person was at the
yeah,
time. I don't
yeah,
know. It was written, I don't know how they are today. It won't capture them today, but it captured them in that moment.
yeah. I'd say right now, still having a rough day.
Okay.
Would be the answer, given everything going on in the world. But let's, you have this whole list here now of some of the different governing bodies and how they have been handling, DSD and trans athletes. Let's briefly talk through them. I know we could take, books have been written, hours could be spent, but like give me the like top level. Let's start with rugby.
So World Rugby was a leader in this space. They right before the pandemic started, February 2020, brought together an incredibly diverse group of experts from all facets. So trans inclusion, cisgender inclusion, law, physiology, medical, including endocrinology, internal medicine, psychiatry, human rights, ethics, more. And again, why, there's a lot of people who are critical of World Rugby and the decision that they came to. But as a scientist and engineer, the transparency in their process, in their thinking, all of this information is available online for anybody to look at. I think in terms of trying to remove bias, I think they did the best job that they could do. I think it was as extensive and as balanced at the time as it could possibly be. Would I love for them to do it again? Wholeheartedly. I can't even imagine what it would cost now compared to $2020. Just putting that out there.
Well, that point actually is very important. I think, as these policies are set, I think it is important that we not think of them as the be all end all final like line in the sand because the lines in the sand are shifting. Not only are we learning more, there are other like there's just more research available. There are more medical interventions available. Like there are different things now that, year after year after year, this stuff is changing. So like a policy that made sense in 2020 may not make sense in 2026. So I think, yeah, that's
Can we
just like
stay
a
with
very
2025? I'm still in 2025.
yeah, we're
Just
still yeah. I'm just
okay.
like giving them an extra year. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I understand where you are now. But I think really also what I want to highlight when, World Rugby says, their transgender policy says that to play as a transgender man, you have to be qualified for safety reasons so that you don't get hurt. And their policy, which is only for the elite level, like really want to stress only for the elite level, does not permit transgender women to play currently. And I know that they're going to revisit it. And they did it. They couldn't balance safety, fairness, and inclusion. And given the context sport of rugby, they prioritized safety. And they were very clear that this was for the elite level. And what they cannot control for is what club and provincial and state rugby chooses to do.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think, and that like at the elite level and making it very clear that the elite level is what they're talking about, I think does make a difference when it comes to inclusion. I think especially, and I don't know how they framed it, but like I actually really appreciate when groups will do something like that, but then add like but we believe that like it's at this elite level. It's not at the participation level. It's not at the amateur level. I know in endurance sport that has certainly come up a fair bit. A triathlon, I think, really like has come in and out of doing good and bad things and that side of things. But I appreciate that at least they like pull the two apart for the most part when they're looking at regulations.
And we need to talk about swimming and UCI and the other ones, but I think that's a big point here, right? I think what we keep forgetting is what we do at elite sport doesn't work at community sport. And what we do at community sport doesn't work at the elite level. And we keep trying to fit these things in without really thinking about what that is. And so I think we have to press pause when federations make these decisions to say, let's take a nuanced look at this. I may not agree with it, but how do I use, indigenous ways of knowing and doing, and from a strength-based perspective, what's really good about what they did before I go into criticism, because you'll find something really good in there. And again, the good for me in there is the unbelievable amount of knowledge that is available for everybody and the thoughtfulness. So swimming's a little bit different. And swimming's I'm not a fan of, but just like there's my bias. And the reason I'm not a fan of it is that athletes must certify their chromosomal sex, right? So all of a sudden it's back to this binary pass fail, but it also put it down to the member federations. And maybe actually it is better because member federations can protect their athletes, but it was almost like World Aquatics like passed the buck off, right? Like, hey, we're going to make this policy, but member federations, yeah, you're actually responsible for administering it. World Aquatics also includes high diving and water polo, and to participate as a transgender man, similar to rugby, you actually have to be qualified. And actually, let me add an asterisk that all of these, and what actually is great as a perimenopause woman for my other perimenopause and menopause friends, you can now get a temporary use exemption, so a TUE, as a transgender man to play elite sport, which you couldn't do before, but that has changed. And so, like, things that are good things that have come out of this, that to me is one of the good things that have come out of this. The UCI, so the Union Cycliste Internationale, my French is terrible. Um, their guidelines are very similar to World Aquatics. And so you have to present eligibility from your member federation. Chris Mosier. Chris Mosier, thank you. I'm gonna let, sorry, Molly, you have some, yes, Molly, how can I help you?
Oh no, now I've almost forgotten what I was going to say. Oh, the member federations. This is
Yeah,
what I have like a question about where it comes back to the where's the money coming from, right? Like if a
exactly.
member federation is not, if you're from a federation that does not have a lot of money. So here, we are thinking about some of the smaller European countries, the African countries, the Caribbean nations, like all of these countries that, don't have a lot of money, period, don't have a lot of money for women,
Yeah.
period. Now the women actually have this added fee associated with them. Guess what's going to happen to women's sport in those areas?
Even here in Canada, right? Sport is like, it's not a funding priority. And like, listen, we're not debating that on this right now. This will take away from the athletes. Like just full stop, period, right? Who pays for it? The athletes pay for it, right? Because why? Because now we have to have somebody whose job it is to actually administer this. So that's a salary that we have to pay for. And then we have to actually do all these tests. Chris Mosier has this great website called transathlete.com. Chris has reviewed every one of these policies, and I may not agree with everything that he says, but he has reviewed all of these policies in a very nuanced and thoughtful way. And so, Chris, just thank you. Just thank you.
100%. Yeah. We will include a link to that in the show notes. Because again, even knowledge of all of the ways that different sports are approaching this, I think is important.
Agreed. So this is my like call to Kirsty Coventry, right? Kirsty Coventry was just elected as the president of the IOC. And she says that she is going to revisit the document that was released in 2021. And I actually have to read this because it is so long. So the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, released a framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. You can see why I have to read that. It's very long. But bias, in all honesty, I'm not impressed with this document. I don't know that it's rooted in science and evidence. And I remember when it came out, I was teaching first year engineering design. It's like, ladies and gentlemen, if you handed this in as your first year engineering design assignment, I would have failed you. There's no citations, right? And then to your point about funding, the IOC put this to the federations. You will do this, right? This falls on you. And it's a 10 principled framework. And principle number 5, which is like where people really got their backup, was that there's no presumed advantage. And that's challenging for me, right? There are performance differences between males and females, right? It's not just because of testosterone, right? Just like asterisk, full stop, right? Line in the sand. It's a whole host of other things. But I'd love to see, this is my call to Kirsty Coventry. And I think this is going to happen, right? Like, let's update this framework. First, let's ground it in peer-reviewed great research because there's a lot of
That we
peer-reviewed,
link to.
and there's also a lot of peer-reviewed bad research. And then the IOC has a lot of money compared to these international federations. And I'd love to see like a third party kind of like pot of money created that the IFs work with researchers. I would love to see it that the researchers come at this first and not the international federations. There are biased researchers out there that will manipulate the science and p-hack. That's right. I'm introducing one of my favorite words in the world, p-hacking, to get the result that they want. But I think there's a real opportunity to make sport better from a whole host of different reasons through looking at this framework again.
100%. And yes, to touch on the research point, I think if you are in the if you're in this area of research, if this is your area of specialty, there is literally zero chance that you do not have an inherent bias in one direction or the other on this topic. You just wouldn't be in this like area of research if you didn't. So I think, yeah, it's so important that we almost need like a peer review group of the peer review groups. I don't know.
Well, it's just talking about implicit bias, right? Like we just have to be aware of our implicit biases. And so then just the last agency I want to mention is WADA, so the World Anti-Doping Association. And there is this like footnote buried on page 146 of the WADA code. So an international federation could use data from a doping control test, so pee or blood, to monitor eligibility relating to transgender or other eligibility rules, right? That one's a bit of a tough one for me.
Sneaky,
Sneaky.
sneaky, sneaky.
Yeah. Footnote. It's a footnote. It's like not even like in it's 23.2.2. It's footnote, I think 115 on page 146.
Yeah, that seems like burying the lead like a tiny, tiny bit there.
Yeah.
Um, it- I dislike when organizations sneak stuff like that in a section that only Sasha would get to.
That's true. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. And actually, this episode comes out as the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport is sort of rebranding, not rebranding, but it's coming out as its new version of sport integrity. And the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport has really always held ethics in that. And when this statement came out, they basically said to Canada from a human rights perspective, please know that we will never be testing for your eligibility. And so all of the respect, because that's integrity, right? Like that is true integrity.
And not burying it in a footnote.
Oh, and it was a press release. They were very open about it. We're not doing this. And, you know, there's a lot of criticism going around about the move that the Canadian Center for Ethics in Sport is making, but I wholeheartedly see it as like it is really strengthening sport integrity at the elite level in Canada, which is what they need to focus on.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so we have a good example on inclusion that I know you are very excited about. Hit
I'm
us.
so
This
excited.
is so specific, by the way. Like when we have to go to Australian rules football to get to a policy that you like.
Well, okay, and the world leading expert in this research pointed me to this policy, Madeline Pape, right? So Madeline, I said to Madeline one day, like, what is the best example for transgender and differences of sexual development inclusion? She's like, the Australian rules football gender guidelines. I was like, come again? What? Excuse that sport? Anyways, it's phenomenal, right? I'm not sorry, Australian football. I'm not dismissing the work that you do, the work that you did, but it's a sport played in Australia primarily. They do a changeover with something in the UK. I can't remember the name of it. Um, but their guidelines are very specific to community and to elite. And what I love about the community one, I'm like hugging myself about it. It's they want everybody to play this sport, right? It's part of the identity of Australians, right? It's like national pride. And effectively, they say, come, show up as you are, play where you want. And effectively, at the end of it, which is like true to Australian rules football, don't be a jerk, right? Don't be a dickhead, right? Just, and, and it's for anybody, right? Like, regardless of how you show up, we are not here to harm each other while we play this sport. And I think that's what's been lost in this conversation. And then they really went with the nuance. And so at the elite level, trans and non-binary people are eligible to play in elite football competitions, bracket women, and the elite pathway competitions. So you have to submit an application to play. And so it's based on your height, your weight, your bench press, both your one rep and your three rep. By the way, I never do one rep because I'm always afraid of hurting myself. I'm like an 8 rep person. Uh,
Like, is that like a trick question? Like, I don't do one reps. And they're like, oh, okay.
kind of like could we have anyways, same thing with the squat, a 20-meter sprint time, vertical jump, and then match draw GPS data, sorry, from 3 football matches if available. You may not have that. And a 2 kilometer run time, but also like 2 kilometer, like that seems mean. Like it's not a 1500, it's not a 3000. Like how would you time that? So it's more nuanced, but coming back to Joanna Harper's work, it misses the human rights angle and it misses the psychosocial.
Yes, but still pretty
Better.
good. And you know what I do like about it is that like it really assumes the best in people, which I think is really where we need to keep coming back to. Like people like any trans athlete I've talked to, no one is trying to like sneak in or like like no one did this in order to um yeah, people are really playing Australian rules football for the money. They're in it for the fame.
No.
Not happening.
No, not happening.
So I
So
do like that this is just like we're assuming that you are going to actually do your heaviest bench press, your heaviest squat, your fastest run. Like I like that. Um, yeah, this is all like so difficult, but I think organizations like this that are pushing inclusion first, I think they're doing the best job personally.
Well, and I didn't say this at the beginning, and I really should have. World Athletics really is a leader in gender equity, which is where I find this at odds. And, they were the first to have gender equity on their council, right? They were aiming for 50-50 in, I think it was for 2026. They did it in 2023. Like there's so much good happening there. And then I can also see this from like the other side of like why we people think we need testing. And I'm trying to be neutral. And I loved, like I really am listening to things from all sides. So Ross Tucker has a podcast called The Science of Sport with Mike Finch and Gareth. Gareth, I'm sorry, I forget your last name. And Ross Tucker made such a salient point. We, they've introduced this, but no one's proposed a viable solution instead of SRY testing. And I'm like, yeah, fair. Yeah, good point. And so, I think the compromise would be that before the World Athletics Championships is that we just do doping control, right? If it's part of the WADA code, whether we agree with it or not, that is not the conversation right now. It's there, right? We've talked about, I'm wearing this shirt, Runners Against Doping. Athletics, right? The Athletics Integrity Unit, which is the third party testing agency, there are more than 640 people that are currently banned from athletics, right? Cycling was the problem. Athletics is now the problem. I don't have, I'm not an ostrich, my head's not in the sand. I would rather know that you're doing doping control in the advance of the 2025 World Championships. And given that there's this WADA clause that you can test for eligibility, let's do that. I mean, if anti-doping testing is about $500 to $1,000 per test, it falls in the same cost as the SRY or the dry blood spot test. So I think it's a reasonably good compromise for now.
Totally. Yeah, with you. I think, yeah, drug testing makes a lot more sense. I think like, yeah, my caution to anyone who has listened to like some of Ross Tucker's stuff and or read Alex Hutchinson's breakdown on Outside of like some recent research with trans and DSD athletes in sport. I do think we always have to come back to anytime anyone talks about protecting women's sport, that we also ask, what the hell else are we doing to protect women's sport? Because if protecting women's sport is only about keeping out trans athletes and DSD women, I do not think we are doing that great of a job for women's sport. um, and I find it frustrating. It's honestly this episode is like very difficult for me to even record because like it is a little terrifying to be talking about something that is so political when I genuinely don't think it should be. But I am perfectly aware that this episode is going to piss some people off. Um, and
It's our reality.
that's that's a reality that is terrifying to me as someone who really does not like a lot of conflict in her life. But I think it's so important that, someone is talking about this and looking at all of the research and taking it, with several grains of salt and talking about the history and kind of presenting all of the stuff that, kind of no matter, like you say, like there isn't really a great solution for sure. But there are great solutions to other issues that we could be focusing on instead, or, right now, as we kind of try to figure out a solution that does, less harm, does no harm, perhaps. You have this great last line here of the who's more harmed in this, those tested or those identified in testing. And I'd say, like, right now, like, to me, this policy harms all women.
Yeah.
It puts strain on federations, it puts strain on women. It shows girls that to be a woman means subjecting your body to, third party testing, basically. Like, it kind of like makes me feel like I need an NSF certified for sport like label on my forehead.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm glad you brought some lightness to it. Oh my gosh. I It's true, but so it's absurdity, right? Like I think there's a famous Latin quote in there that I absolutely cannot remember, but it's I think that absurdity. Like, am I gonna walk around with a badge that says I'm a real woman? Like that's so harmful to so many people in this world.
Yeah, we have enough. struggles and barriers facing us as girls and women without also then needing to prove that we are in fact girls and women. So that is where I come down, just picturing 12-year-old Molly, 12-year-old Sasha, seeing these rules. Even just like, yeah, picturing girls having to line up to go to the nurse's office to get tested to see if they're a girl. Um, Imagine the bullying that comes from that.
I wouldn't even
Imagine,
go to the nurse's office to get a tampon. Like,
no,
oh,
like just, yeah, picture that. And to me, that's where this is potentially heading.
yeah. It's
And
that trickle,
that's
right? That for me was the real challenge, right? The reason that, it was so important to me to talk about this was what's the trickle down, right? Yes, World Athletics is doing this. Yes, the worst place in the world to look at information is X, but someone posted there, well, it's not good enough if you just do it there. We need to make sure that they're not getting to the national championships or the state championships or the local school championships. And that's that trickle down effect where it's so harmful. And so, I don't know, I guess if I wanted to leave you with one thing, it would be just kindness, and not you specifically, but like the world. Like, how do we show up with more kindness? And how do we show up with more nuance? And how do we show up to say, I hear you, I feel you, you're valued, and to take in information and to think again and to think differently and just make people feel welcome so that they can find their sense of belonging. And running's such a beautiful metaphor for that.
could not agree more. Okay, let's wrap our first emergency episode. Thank you, everyone who has followed along, listened to this one. It's a big one, but I think a very important one. We'll be back on Friday with a little more levity, a little more of a fun topic. Um, but we are not shying away from the tricky stuff here. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.